When we talk about the Middle Ages, most people think of knights and castles, but the real story is about how people made a living. For centuries, the economy was mostly locked down in a system called manorialism. Everything was local. But around 1000 CE, things started to change dramatically. This shift introduced key economic ideas like supply and demand. We're going to explore how these forces, how much stuff was available, supply, and how much people wanted, demand, shaped the medieval world, especially as small towns grew into bustling centers of trade. Think of supply as all the goods a seller has to offer. In the beginning of the Middle Ages, supply was small and predictable. Most of the supply was basic farm goods like wheat and barley, all produced on a lord's manor. Imagine trying to run a huge farm using old wooden tools. You can only produce so much. If the weather was bad, the supply of grain would drop overnight, and everyone was in trouble. Supply was very much at the mercy of Mother Nature and simple technology. Now for demand. Demand is what people need and want to buy. If you lived on a manor, your demands were simple: food to eat, a roof over your head, and clothes to wear. But as Europe's population started to boom, more people survived into adulthood. The demand for everything skyrocketed. There were suddenly a lot more mouths to feed, and a lot more people who wanted better clothes or a new tool. Plus, you had wealthy nobles with a huge demand for fancy, imported goods like spices and silk, which drove trade across continents. The manorial system was the original, highly controlled economic model. Picture a giant, self-contained estate run by a lord. The entire goal was subsistence, producing just enough for the people who lived there and the lord who protected them. Since almost everything needed was produced right there wasn't a big need to trade with the outside world. This meant the forces of supply and demand were almost entirely internal. The lord simply commanded the serfs to produce the supply he needed. It was a closed economic loop. The turning point came with new technology. The invention of the heavy plow and the three-field crop rotation system suddenly meant farmers could produce a surplus, more food than they needed. If a farmer had extra grain, he could take it to a nearby village and sell it for cash. This simple surplus was revolutionary. It meant people didn't have to be farmers anymore. They could move to a town, become a specialized craftsman, and buy their food with money. The extra food supplied the demand of the growing cities, kicking off a true market economy. Local markets were the heartbeat of medieval daily life. If you were a peasant in a village, you probably walked to a market day once a week. This is where local supply met local demand directly. The farmer from the next village would bring eggs, cheese, and vegetables. It was highly localized trade, often measured by how far a person could walk in a day. Because low-value goods like firewood or a bushel of oats were expensive to move. The local supply had to meet the local demand, right there on the village square. Trade fairs were on a completely different level. Imagine a regional trade show that lasted for weeks. These weren't for buying a dozen eggs. They were for wholesale and international trade. The most famous were the Champagne fairs in France, which became like a huge, temporary stock exchange. Merchants from Italy, Flanders, and Germany would meet there to exchange massive quantities of high-value goods like wool cloth, wine, and exotic spices, linking the supply chains of all of Europe and beyond. They were the engines of long-distance economic demand. As the economy grew, towns and cities became magnets for opportunity. While manors were focused on farming, towns were focused on craft and commerce. They provided a centralized, high-density demand for food and raw materials, drawing supply from the surrounding countryside. In return, towns were where all the specialized supply was created. The shoes, the armor, the jewelry, the carved furniture. They were the economic engines that drove the shift away from purely agrarian life creating the first true urban markets. In the cities, a new power structure emerged, the craft guilds. These were not just social clubs. They were powerful economic organizations for a specific trade, like tailors or goldsmiths. The guild's main role was to control the supply of their product. They would limit how many people could become masters, set the quality standards, and most importantly, set the price. They essentially created a monopoly to protect their members, making sure they weren't competing against each other and driving prices down. The guild structure also served a positive economic function by ensuring quality and training. To become a master, you had to pass through the ranks of apprentice and journeyman, creating a masterpiece at the end. This system guaranteed a high-quality supply of goods, which kept consumers coming back. If a baker consistently sold bad bread, the guild might punish him. So while guilds limited the sheer volume of supply to keep prices up, they ensured the supply that was available met a high standard of quality. While craft guilds focused on making things, merchant guilds focused on moving and selling them. These were the big players, the wholesalers. They worked to control the flow of supply across vast distances. Think of a group of traveling salespeople who pool their resources for protection and political power. They bargained for lower taxes and better trade routes. The Hanseatic League, for instance, was a super guild of northern European cities that effectively controlled the entire supply of goods, like timber and fish, across the Baltic and North Seas. Nothing illustrates the basic tension between supply and demand like food. Demand for food was constant and non-negotiable. Everyone needed to eat. But the supply was seasonal and easily destroyed by weather. If there was a great harvest, the supply shot up and prices for grain would fall, benefiting the average person. But if drought or flooding struck, the supply would crash. The demand remained high, so prices would skyrocket, causing widespread famine. This instability was the biggest challenge for the medieval economy. The spice trade is the perfect example of high demand meeting extremely low supply due to distance. Europeans desperately wanted spices like pepper and cloves for both preservation and luxury. The demand was huge, but the supply had to travel thousands of miles across mountains and deserts, changing hands many times, with each person adding a markup. By the time it reached a European city, the price was astronomical, sometimes literally worth its weight in gold. This immense profit margin fueled the ambition of merchants and eventually led to the age of exploration as people searched for a cheaper, more direct route to the supply. Labor was the medieval economy's most unique market. In the early period, most labor was not free. Serfs were tied to the lord's land, providing a constant, if inefficient, supply of farm labor. In the cities, you had free laborers, but even their work was controlled by the guilds, which dictated hours and wages. This meant there was no true free market for labor. A lord or a guild master had a tremendous amount of control over both the supply of workers and the price, wage, paid for their work. The Black Death was a cataclysmic event, but it also caused a massive, unexpected economic shift. When half the population died, the supply of labor, the number of available workers, plunged. Suddenly, the surviving laborers were in high demand. They could leave the manors and demand higher wages in the cities. This drastic shift in the supply and demand for labor spelled the beginning of the end for serfdom and permanently improved the economic position of the common worker. In the modern world, we usually let supply and demand set the price, but medieval leaders believed they had a moral duty to prevent price gouging. They implemented price controls for essential goods, most famously the assize of bread and ale. This law fixed the price of bread based on the cost of the ingredients, aiming to protect the average consumer from being exploited by a baker who might charge an unfair price when grain was scarce. It was an attempt by the government to manage the market, especially when the supply was low and demand was high. As the manor system declined, money became essential. Bartering, trading 2 chickens for a shovel, doesn't work well in a large market. You need a medium of exchange, which is currency. The rise of trade fairs required money changers who could recognize and swap coins from different regions: Venice, Flanders, England. These people were the forerunners of modern bankers. They also started to offer credit, or loans, which were necessary to finance the huge upfront cost of moving a large supply of goods across the continent. The medieval supply chain had major hurdles. The biggest drag on supply was transportation. Moving anything over land was incredibly slow and costly due to poor roads and the need to pay tolls to every local lord. Imagine the high cost adding up on a sack of wool just to travel 100 miles. This is why rivers and the sea were so vital. They offered a cheaper, more efficient way to move large volumes of supply, making trade across Europe and the Mediterranean far more feasible than overland routes. The vibrant markets of the High Middle Ages represent the first cracks in the feudal system. Feudalism was based on land ownership and loyalty. The market economy was based on wealth, money, and profit. Merchants who didn't own land but controlled vast amounts of money and goods began to gain political power. The rise of this merchant class, along with the new freedom of laborers after the plague, pushed Europe toward a system based more on trade, enterprise, and capital, the seeds of future capitalism. So when you look back at the medieval period, don't just see a static time of kings and peasants. See a time of incredible economic evolution. The economy transformed from one of isolated, self-sufficient manors into a thriving network of local and international markets. Supply and demand, though constrained by politics and nature, were the forces that broke down the old feudal system, created a wealthy new middle class, and set the stage for the modern economic world we live in today.